Imagine a chilling scene unfolding in the heart of 18th century Paris, a man bound tightly, trembling, surrounded by countless cold eyes. This is no joyous event. Instead, it is a horrifying spectacle of revenge, where the very identity of a human being is to be erased piece by piece. The air is thick with tension, filled not with cheers, but with agonized screams and dreadful silence. This is no ordinary execution. It is a meticulously orchestrated ritual designed to tear a man's body apart into 4 pieces. At the center of this grim drama stands Robert-François Damiens, the only man in French history subjected to such a brutal fate. His name is forever etched in the darkest chapters of France, remembered for the savage punishment inflicted upon him for a crime that shocked a nation, the attempted assassination of King Louis XV, who was Robert-François Damiens. An ordinary man forgotten by history, or a desperate soul driven to an act so violent that it challenged the absolute power of a king. His deed was more than just an attack. It was a defiant strike at the heart of an ancient regime, a direct confrontation with divine authority. The story of Damiens is not merely about punishment. It is a grim symbol of justice twisted into cruelty, a public performance of power where pain became a language of control. Every scream, every tear shed during his execution echoed far beyond that day, resonating through the fear-soaked streets and minds of 18th century France. What led an unremarkable man to face such a monstrous death? What does his fate reveal about the nature of power and justice under the Ancien Régime? These questions linger in the shadows of history, beckoning us to explore a time when punishment was as much about spectacle as it was about law. As we journey through the life and death of Robert-François Damiens, prepare to confront a reality where justice becomes a terrifying theater. This is a story steeped in sorrow, power, and the macabre. It demands your full attention. To understand the tragedy of Robert-François Damiens, we must first immerse ourselves in the world he inhabited, a France ruled by the Ancien Régime, where monarchy was absolute and social hierarchy rigidly enforced. The year was the mid-18th century, and Louis XV sat on the throne, ruling not merely as a political leader, but as a near-divine figure whose authority was considered unquestionable. The king's image was carefully cultivated as the symbol of order and stability, yet beneath the opulent facade of Versailles, unrest simmered quietly. French society was sharply divided. At the top stood the monarchy nobility and clergy-privileged classes, enjoying wealth, influence, and exemption from many taxes. Below them lay the vast majority peasants, artisans, and servants like Damiens himself, who struggled daily under heavy taxation, economic hardship, and limited opportunity. This stark inequality bred resentment, a bitter undercurrent of frustration that often found no legitimate outlet. Robert-François Damiens was born into obscurity, a man whose life story was far removed from the gilded halls of power. Records suggest he worked as a domestic servant and later lived as a somewhat marginal figure, disenfranchised and isolated. His exact origins are murky, but what stands out is his steady slide into poverty and despair. Unlike nobles who wielded influence, Damiens had no protection, no political backing. His world was one of hardship, alienation, and growing bitterness. Personality-wise, he was described by contemporaries as volatile and easily angered. Some historians suggest that Damiens suffered from mental instability, or at least was driven by desperation. His actions cannot be divorced from the context of a man who felt powerless in the face of a system that crushed the weak and rewarded the privileged. His grievances may have been personal or political, or perhaps a disturbing mixture of both. At the heart of his story lies the attempt to stab King Louis XV with a penknife on January 5, 1757. The attack was shocking in its brazenness. It was not a covert plot, but a violent direct assault. The king was only lightly wounded, but the implications were profound. To strike the monarch was to challenge not just an individual, but the entire order of France, a sacred, inviolable institution grounded in divine right and centuries of tradition. Damiens was quickly apprehended. His crime, attempted regicide, was considered the gravest offense imaginable. It transcended political rebellion. It was sacrilege. The king was not simply a man. He was the embodiment of the state, the divine ruler ordained by God himself. Attacking him was an assault on the very fabric of society. Damiens' place in history is singular. Unlike nobles who conspired behind closed doors, or later revolutionaries who rose with armies, he was a lone figure whose violent act stunned the nation. His common origins contrasted sharply with the royal court's luxury, emphasizing the chasm between ruler and ruled. The monarchy's response to Damiens was to make an example so horrific that no one would dare follow in his footsteps. His trial and execution became a macabre public drama. While kings and ministers wielded power through decrees and diplomacy, Damiens' rebellion forced the state to wield power through terror and spectacle. This stark contrast reveals much about 8th century France's underlying tensions, a society where justice was intertwined with fear, where the sacredness of the monarch demanded ruthless retribution. Damiens' story is a dark mirror reflecting the cruelty embedded within the Ancien Régime's mechanisms of control. By understanding the historical and social backdrop of Damiens' life, we see how his desperate act was both a symptom and a challenge to a system built on inequality and absolute power. His fate was sealed not only by his crime, but by the very structure of a society unwilling to tolerate dissent or vulnerability. The world that Robert-François Damiens confronted was one steeped in ruthless control and relentless oppression. Under the reign of Louis XV, the monarchy wielded power not merely through law, but through a system designed to crush any flicker of dissent before it could ignite. The king's authority was absolute, and the machinery of the state operated with chilling efficiency to maintain this dominance. France's ruling elite viewed opposition as a threat to the very essence of their existence. To protect the monarchy, a campaign of oppression swept across the land, instilling fear among nobles, clergy, and commoners alike. Secret police and informants infiltrated neighborhoods and workplaces, watching for any sign of disloyalty. Whispers of conspiracy were enough to warrant arrest, interrogation, or worse. This pervasive surveillance created an atmosphere thick with paranoia and mistrust. Damiens' attack was seen as the ultimate transgression, an intolerable breach that demanded a response both brutal and exemplary. The swift capture of the assassin set in motion a wave of repression. Not only was Damiens himself subjected to the harshest penalties, but suspicion and punishment rippled outward to his family and associates. In the tightly knit communities of the time, guilt by association was a harsh reality, and families of offenders faced public shame and legal sanctions. Women related to political enemies found themselves vulnerable as well, stripped of status, deprived of protection, and sometimes punished by association. The church, closely entwined with royal power, lent its moral authority to justify these harsh measures, branding dissent as heresy or blasphemy. The spiritual condemnation reinforced the political repression, merging sacred and secular powers in a deadly alliance. Underpinning this system was an extensive network of spies and informants who monitored everything from taverns to markets. Trust became a dangerous commodity. People lived in fear not only of the authorities, but of neighbors who might betray them for personal gain or survival. In this suffocating climate, Damiens' violent act was perceived as the spark that threatened to ignite a widespread rebellion. The government's response was meticulous and merciless. Every arrest, every confiscation of property, every public humiliation was a calculated move to demonstrate the cost of defiance. The message was clear: any challenge to the king's sovereignty would be met with overwhelming force. This relentless crackdown maintained a tense stability, but beneath it simmered resentment and hostility. Damiens himself became the face of this tension. The state transformed him from a desperate man into a symbol of treachery and chaos. Public opinion was swayed through propaganda that painted him as a monstrous figure, a danger not only to the king, but to the very order of society. Fear was weaponized to justify extraordinary measures. Yet, in the cold logic of power, this campaign of oppression was a double-edged sword. While it secured temporary control, it also deepened fractures within French society. The widespread fear and repression alienated many, fostering an environment ripe for future unrest. The fragile balance of power was held together by cruelty, a grim foreshadowing of the upheavals to come. In this shadowy world, Damiens' personal tragedy merged with the broader story of a regime fighting for survival. The campaign of hostility he became enmeshed in was not only a response to his crime, but a reflection of a monarchy's desperate attempt to silence dissent by any means necessary. Despite the iron grip of the monarchy and its brutal campaign of suppression, the undercurrents of discontent in France continued to swell beneath the surface. Robert-François Damiens' violent attack on King Louis XVIII did more than shock the nation. It exposed the fragile cracks in a system that seemed unshakable. At first, the reaction was fear and horror. The public witnessed the state's terrifying response, a vivid display of merciless justice meant to discourage any similar defiance. Yet beneath that veneer of control, a whisper of rebellion began to grow louder. The act of one desperate man became a symbol of broader unrest, an unsettling signal to the privileged that the masses were not as submissive as they appeared. Signs of resistance took many forms. Nobles, weary of the king's favoring of certain courtiers and resentful of increasing taxation, began to question their loyalty. Common people, crushed by poverty and injustice, muttered words of discontent in shadowed corners. The intellectual currents of the Enlightenment spread ideas that challenged the divine right of kings and the legitimacy of such unchecked authority. The monarchy found itself on precarious footing. Ministers debated how best to respond. Some called for even harsher repression, while others feared that cruelty would only fuel rebellion. This internal tension reflected a regime unsure of its own strength. Damiens' trial was swift and public, designed to demonstrate the consequences of treason. Yet the spectacle of his punishment, gruesome and extreme, had a paradoxical effect. While it terrified many, it also provoked unease and pity among others. The king's image, once untouchable, now seemed vulnerable. The violence meted out in his name revealed a regime trembling before a rising storm. As the years passed, disillusionment deepened. The monarchy's authority eroded not with a sudden collapse, but through a series of fractures, loss of trust, increasing inequality, and political rivalries. The very spectacle intended to affirm the king's inviolability instead highlighted the fragility of his rule. Damiens' fate became a dark prelude to the upheavals that would eventually engulf France. His desperate rebellion foreshadowed the widespread insurrection that would challenge and ultimately overturn the Ancien Régime. The terror that followed his crime was a symptom of a deeper sickness within society, a warning unheeded by those in power. In the end, the monarchy's collapse was not merely political. It was a crisis of legitimacy. The brutal repression, the fear, and the spectacle of punishment failed to silence the growing calls for justice and equality. Damien's story, tragic and violent, stands as a stark symbol of a system struggling to hold itself together, a testament to the cost of ruling through fear alone. The execution of Robert-François Damiens was no mere act of justice. It was a carefully choreographed performance of power, a gruesome spectacle intended to send a message so forceful and unforgettable that it would echo through the streets and minds of France for generations. What awaited Damiens was not simply death, it was a systematic, torturous unraveling of his body and identity, a public ritual designed to obliterate any trace of his crime and his existence. On a cold March day in 1757, Damiens was dragged through the bustling streets of Paris to the Place de Grève, the traditional site for the kingdom's most notorious executions. The procession was slow and deliberate, his bound figure paraded before a crowd, swelling with a mix of horror, morbid curiosity, and vengeful zeal. This was the beginning of a ritual that would transform punishment into theater pain, into spectacle. Once positioned on the execution scaffold, the stage was set for a sequence of tortures unparalleled in cruelty. Damiens was first tied to a wooden frame, his limbs splayed and secured. The executioners approached with instruments of agony, red-hot pincers, knives, and a large saw. The crowd fell into a tense silence, broken only by the crackling of fire and the harsh commands of the officials. The initial torment involved the repeated tearing of his skin with heated pincers. Each searing bite was excruciatingly slow, designed not only to inflict unbearable pain, but to symbolize the purging of his sins and rebellion against the crown. His screams, raw and piercing, echoed against the stone facades, a visceral reminder of the king's wrath made flesh. Following this agonizing ordeal came the symbolic castration, one of the most brutal acts of humiliation imaginable. The severing of his genitalia was laden with meaning. It represented the total loss of power, virility, and lineage. By this act, the state declared that Damiens was utterly stripped of manhood and any capacity to threaten the royal order again. It was a physical and psychological annihilation, a public statement that his challenge to the monarch was permanently extinguished. The execution escalated in horror. The disembowelment followed as the executioners cut open his abdomen, removing his intestines and ultimately his heart. This act carried profound symbolism, the purging of the poison within the destruction of the seat of life and loyalty. The heart was ripped out and burned before the crowd's eyes, a ritualistic cleansing that declared his betrayal utterly unforgivable. The final, most grisly step was the dismemberment of his body into 4 parts. Each limb was severed with a saw, a violent and definitive act that erased his physical identity. This extreme measure was reserved only for the gravest crimes against the crown, underscoring the gravity of his offense. To be cut into pieces was to be denied a proper burial, a final condemnation that his memory be scattered and forgotten. Throughout this harrowing ordeal, the crowd's reactions were varied and revealing. Some jeered and sang mocking songs, their voices carrying a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Others watched in stunned silence, unable to fully comprehend the brutality inflicted. The atmosphere was charged with a perverse blend of justice and cruelty, where punishment became a public spectacle, a theater of terror designed to reinforce the king's absolute authority. Politically, this execution was a calculated act of dominance. It was not simply about punishing a man for attempted regicide. It was about reaffirming the inviolability of the monarch and the supremacy of the state. The grotesque ritual sent a clear message to anyone who might entertain thoughts of rebellion. The consequences would be unimaginably severe. The spectacle also reflected the fragile nature of royal power. Such an extreme demonstration was a defensive response to a threat that shook the foundations of the regime. It revealed a monarchy clinging to control through fear, wielding terror as a tool of governance. Damiens' death remains a chilling reminder of how justice can be distorted into cruelty and how punishment can become a tool of political theater. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the limits of state power, the nature of justice, and the human capacity for suffering. This execution was more than an end. It was a terrifying symbol of a system's need to project strength through brutality. The echoes of that day linger, still haunting the history of France as a testament to the dark extremes of absolute authority. The gruesome execution of Robert-François Damiens sent shockwaves far beyond the Place de Grève. Its immediate impact was a brutal reaffirmation of royal authority. The monarchy tightened its grip, proclaiming victory over rebellion and disobedience. But beneath this facade of power and control, the event exposed deep fractures within the French state and society, fractures that would eventually widen and contribute to the collapse of the Ancien Régime. In the days and months that followed, the government reinforced its surveillance and repression mechanisms. Damiens' execution was wielded as a potent tool of propaganda, a stark warning engraved in the collective memory the king's person was sacred, and any attack upon it would be met with merciless retribution. Officials paraded this message through sermons, public declarations, and the courts, weaving it into the very fabric of French life. Yet the severity and spectacle of Damiens' punishment also sparked discomfort and debate among contemporaries. Even within royalist circles, questions arose. Was such cruelty necessary? Did it enhance the monarchy's prestige, or rather reveal its vulnerabilities? The grotesque violence laid bare the fragility beneath the monarchy's ostentatious power. It was a vivid reminder that fear, though effective in the short term, could not mask the deeper tensions roiling beneath French society. Politically, the execution contributed to a growing discourse on justice and governance. It highlighted the dangers inherent in an absolute monarchy that demanded total obedience while punishing dissent with horrific violence. For many observers, it underscored the urgent need for reform, an idea that would later fuel the Enlightenment and the revolutionary movements. The legal and cultural implications of Damiens' death resonated for decades. His execution stood as a symbol of extreme corporeal punishment, used as a political tool, a spectacle designed to awe and terrorize, rather than simply to administer justice. This brutal use of public execution influenced debates about the morality and efficacy of punishment, eventually contributing to the gradual shift toward more humane legal practices. Culturally, the event became woven into France's artistic and literary consciousness. Writers and philosophers reflected on the execution as a manifestation of tyranny and the dark side of justice. It inspired cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked power and the dehumanizing effects of absolute rule. In this way, Damiens' tragic end transcended its immediate horror to become a symbol of the complex relationship between authority, justice, and humanity. The echoes of his suffering and death invite profound reflection. How does a society balance the necessity of law and order with compassion and humanity? What lessons can be drawn from a time when punishment was a public spectacle and the ruler's authority was maintained through terror? In the larger sweep of history, the execution marked a grim milestone. It foreshadowed the rising tide of revolution that would sweep France a few decades later. The monarchy's reliance on fear and spectacle revealed its desperation and disconnect from the populace. When the people no longer believed in the sanctity of the throne, the carefully constructed edifice of absolute power began to crumble. Robert-François Damiens remains a haunting figure, a man whose desperate act and horrific fate embodied the contradictions of his age. His story challenges us to examine the costs of power wielded without restraint, and the human toll of justice turned merciless. As we look back centuries later, his legacy is a solemn reminder of the shadows that can lurk behind the grandeur of history. The brutal performance that ended his life serves as a call to remember the fragility of human dignity and the enduring need to temper authority with justice. This story leaves us with an open question: how can societies learn from such dark chapters to build systems of power that are just humane and sustainable? The echoes of Damien's screams may have faded, but their lessons remain vital, urging us to look critically at the balance between power and mercy in every age.